All right, well, this is it. Uh, Even though the sun is in and out, it's still kind of cold. I was hoping to read the last part of the book without a coat, but that's not going to happen. So we found out the fifth person Eddie meets in heaven is the little girl from the war. And we are fairly certain that the lesson he's going to learn here is all lives have meaning or value, which is important for Eddie in the fifth stage of grief and loss to find acceptance for who he was and what he did. And I guess the question that we have to ask is, how is that little girl, Tala, how is she going to impart that lesson to Eddie? At some point, when his anguish had quieted, Eddie felt a tapping on his shoulder. He looked up to see Tala holding out a stone. "You wash me," she said. She stepped into the water and turned her back to Eddie. Then she pulled the embroidered baro over her head. He recoiled. The skin was horribly burned. Her torso and narrow shoulders were black and charred and blistered. And when she turned around, the beautiful, innocent face was covered in grotesque scars. Her lips drooped. Only one eye was open. Her hair was gone in patches of burned scalp, covered now by hard, mottled scabs. "You wash me," she said again, holding out the stone. Eddie dragged himself into the river. He took the stone. His fingers trembled. "I don't know how," he mumbled, barely audible. "I never had children." She raised her charred hand, and Eddie gripped it gently and slowly rubbed the stone along her forearm until the scars began to loosen. He rubbed harder and they peeled away. He quickened his efforts until the singed flesh fell and the healthy flesh was visible. Then he turned the stone over and rubbed her bony back and tiny shoulders and the nape of her neck and finally her cheeks and her forehead and the skin behind her ears. She leaned backward into him, resting her head on his collarbone, shutting her eyes as if falling into a nap. He traced gently around the lids. He did the same with her drooped lips and the scab patches on her head, until the plum-colored hair emerged from the roots and the face that he had seen at first was before him again. When she opened her eyes, the whites flashed out like beacons. "I am 5, she whispered. Eddie lowered the stone and shuddered in short, gasping breaths. 5 years old?" She shook her head no. She held up 5 fingers, and then she pushed them against Eddie's chest as if to say, "You're 5, you're fifth person." A warm breeze blew. A tear rolled down Eddie's face. Tala studied it the way a child studies a bug in the grass, and then she spoke to the space between them. "Why sad?" she said. "Why am I sad?" he whispered. "Here?" She pointed down. "There." Eddie sobbed, a final vacant sob as if his chest were empty. He had surrendered all barriers. There was no grown-up-to-child talk anymore. He said what he always said. To Marguerite, to Ruby, to the captain, to the blue man, and more than anyone, to himself. "I was sad because I didn't do anything with my life. I was nothing. I accomplished nothing. I was lost. I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there." Tala plucked the pipe cleaner dog from the water. "Supposed to be there," she said. "Where? At Ruby Pier?" She nodded. "Fixing rides? That was my existence?" He blew a deep breath. "Why?" She tilted her head as if it were obvious. "Children," she said. "You keep them safe. You make good for me." She wiggled the dog against his shirt. "Is where you were supposed to be," she said, and then she touched his shirt patch with a small laugh and added 2 words. "Eddie maintenance." Eddie slumped in the rushing water. The stones of his stories were all around him now, beneath the surface, one touching another. He could feel his form melting, dissolving, and he sensed that he did not have long. Whatever came after the 5 people you meet in heaven, it was upon him now. "Tala," he whispered. She looked up. "The little girl at the pier. Do you know about her?" Tala stared at her fingertips. She nodded yes. Did I save her? Did I pull her out of the way? Tala shook her head. No pull. Eddie shivered. His head dropped. So there it was, the end of his story. Push, Tala said. He looked up. Push. Push her legs. No pull. You push. Big thing fall. You keep her safe. Eddie shut his eyes in denial. But I felt her hands, he said. It's the only thing I remember. I couldn't have pushed her. I felt her hands. Tala smiled and scooped up river water, then placed her small, wet fingers in Eddie's adult grip, and he knew right away they'd been there before. Not her hands, she said. My hands. I bring you to heaven. Keep you safe. And with that, the river rose quickly, engulfing Eddie's waist and chest and shoulders, and before he could take another breath, the noise of the children disappeared above him, and he was submerged in a strong but silent current. His grip was still entwined with Tala's, but he felt his body being washed from his soul, meat from the bone, and with it went all the pain and weariness he'd ever held inside him, every scar, every wound, every bad memory. He was nothing now, a leaf in the water, and she pulled him gently through shadow and light, through shades of blue and ivory and lemon and black, and he realized all these colors all along were the emotions of his life. She drew him up through the breaking waves of a great gray ocean, and he emerged in brilliant light above an almost imaginable scene. There was a pier filled with thousands of people, men and women, fathers and mothers and children, so many children, children from the past and the present, children who'd not yet been born, side by side, hand in caps and short pants, filling the boardwalk and the rides and the wooden platforms, sitting on each other's shoulders, sitting in each other's laps. They were there, or would be there, because of the simple, mundane things Eddie had done in his life. The accidents he had prevented, the rides he'd kept safe, the unnoticed turns he had effected every day. And while their lips did not move, Eddie heard their voices, more voices than he could have imagined, and a peace came upon him he'd never known before. He was free of Tala's grip now, and he floated up above the sand and above the boardwalk, above the tent tops and spires of the midway toward the peak of a big white Ferris wheel, where a cart was swaying gently, held a woman in a yellow dress, his wife, Marguerite, waiting with her arms extended. He reached for her, and he saw her smile, and the voices melded into a single word from God: home. So Mitch Albom said to us that he wrote this because his uncle felt like he never mattered, that his life was a waste. And what Mitch Albom is trying to tell us here, not me, not your fat old teacher, but what Mitch Albom is trying to tell us is that all lives have meaning and value. All lives. That includes you, that includes me, that includes the mechanic, the plumber, the custodian, all lives. Epilogue. The park at Ruby Pier opened 3 days after the accident. The story of Eddie's death was in the newspapers for a week, and then other stories about other deaths took its place. The ride called Freddy's Free Fall was closed for the season, but the next year it reopened with a new name, Daredevil Drop. Teenagers saw it as a badge of courage, and it drew many customers, and the owners were pleased. Eddie's apartment, the one he'd grown up in, was rented to someone new, who put leaded glass in the kitchen window, obscuring the view of the old carousel. Dominguez, who had agreed to take over Eddie's job, put Eddie's few possessions in a trunk at the maintenance shop along the memorabilia from Ruby Pier, including photos of the original entrance. Nicky, the young man whose key had cut the cable, made a new key when he got home, then sold his car 4 months later. He returned often to Ruby Pier, where he bragged to his friends that his great-grandmother was the woman for whom it was named. Seasons came and seasons went, and when school let out and the days grew long, the crowds returned to the amusement park by the great gray ocean, not as large as those at the theme parks, but large enough. Come the summer, the spirit turns, and the seashore beckons with the song of the waves, and people gather for carousels and Ferris wheels and sweet iced drinks and cotton candy. Lines formed at Ruby Pier, just as a line formed someplace else. 5 people waiting in 5 chosen memories for a little girl named Amy or Annie to grow and to love and to age and to die, and to finally have her questions answered, why she lived and what she lived for. And in that line now is a whiskered old man with a linen cap and a crooked nose, who waited in a place called the Stardust Bandshell to share his part of the secret of heaven, that each affects the other, and the other affects the next, and the world is full of stories, but the stories are all one. So, I really, really like this book. Usually I cry like a baby at the end of it, but instead Mrs. Gustkey is crying like a baby behind the screen right now. So we won't pick on her too much about that. Yes, there is a sequel, if you care to read that. However, if you like Mitch Albom's story, this one, I would encourage you to read others of his stories before you read the sequel. Get more of his philosophy of life, because like he said in the one video we watched, even though people die in his books are really all about life. Can't wait for the next book we read. It's not going to be as heavy and deep and dark, I promise.